It was July 2018, and I was 26, working the night shift at Granville Storage Facility in rural Ohio. I had dropped out of college a couple of years back, and this was where I landed. The manager, Eric, ran the place like it was held together by duct tape and hope. The cameras were unreliable, the locks were outdated, and most nights, it was just me, a small office, and the comforting hum of the fluorescent lights. The job was mostly boring, just the way I liked it. I'd spend the nights sipping lukewarm coffee, scrolling through my phone, and occasionally checking the monitors to make sure nothing strange was going on. It was the kind of routine that let you shut your brain off, and after the chaos of dropping out, it felt like a relief. Then Martin Hall showed up. He wasn't like the other renters. He was always around late, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., sometimes even 4 a.m., paying in cash and dragging around heavy, unmarked boxes. He had this unsettling way about him. Never smiled, always kept his head down, and wore these old leather gloves, even in the summer heat. His unit, number 27, became a place of curiosity and dread for me. I'd catch myself watching him on the cameras, trying to figure out what his deal was. There was something about the way he moved, the way he always seemed to be in a hurry, that made me uneasy. It was maybe 2 weeks after he started renting when the first real scare happened. A break-in. I got in that night, and Eric was already there, cursing under his breath while trying to fix the busted lock on Unit 27. I asked what happened, but he waved me off, saying, "Just some punks. Nothing was even taken." But it didn't sit right with me. Why would anyone target Martin's unit specifically? And how did Eric know nothing was taken if he wasn't in on something? I kept pressing, but Eric just gave me this look, like he was daring me to keep asking questions. Eventually, I let it drop, but the feeling that something was off only got stronger. Martin's behavior only got weirder after that. He started showing up even later, always parking far from the cameras. One night, as he opened the trunk of his car, I caught a glimpse of his gloves under the facility's flickering lights. They were stained, red and dark. Maybe paint, maybe something worse. I could have minded my own business, but curiosity and a gnawing sense of dread kept me from looking away. I started noticing more little things, like how Martin never seemed to struggle with those heavy boxes despite their size. He moved them like they weighed nothing, and it made my skin crawl. I started doing something I shouldn't have. Snooping. One night, I waited until I knew Martin was gone, and I went to Unit 27. Eric had left the spare keys hanging on a hook in the office, careless as always, and I took them. My hands shook as I opened the door. Inside, I found stacks of boxes, some labeled, some not. The air smelled metallic, like rust or blood. Tarps, stained with deep red, were spread across the floor, and strange equipment I couldn't make sense of was scattered around. There were chains, hooks, and something that looked like a surgical saw. I felt the kind of chill that starts in your spine and moves outward, every instinct screaming at me to get out. My heart was pounding, and I could barely think straight. Then I heard it, footsteps. Someone was there. I panicked, shoving a tarp back into place and trying to head for the door, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, and I heard the lock click from the outside. My heart pounded, and I tried not to breathe too loudly. Whoever it was stayed silent. I could hear them moving, pacing, almost like they were deciding what to do next. I remember crouching behind a stack of boxes, my hands trembling as I tried to figure out what to do. Eventually they left, and I was able to get out, barely. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. It felt like hours before I could calm down enough to leave the unit and lock it back up. The next day, I confronted Eric. I had to. I asked him if he knew what Martin was up to, if he knew what was in those boxes. He turned pale the way you do when you've been found out. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he said, "You need to stay out of this. These people, they're not the kind you mess with, all right? Just drop it." But I couldn't drop it, not after what I saw. I pressed him, asked why he was so scared, and he finally broke. "They've got something on me," he admitted. his voice barely a whisper. "I owe them, and if I don't play along, they'll come after me. And after you too if you keep poking around." The last night I worked at Granville, I got a call from Eric. His voice was shaking. "You need to get out," he said, barely above a whisper. "Martin and a couple of his guys are looking for you. They know you've been in the unit." Before I could ask how they knew, I saw headlights cutting through the dark, pulling into the facility. 3 figures stepped out, Martin and 2 others I didn't recognize. They were blocking the exits. I could see the glint of something metal in one of their hands. A crowbar, maybe a gun. My stomach dropped, and I knew this wasn't just a scare tactic. I don't remember much about what happened next. I know I ran. I know I called the police. And I know Eric disappeared not long after that night. They arrested Martin, found enough in Unit 27 to tie him to things I don't even want to think about. But Eric, he was gone, like he never existed. I had to leave Ohio, start over somewhere else. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that I made everything worse by getting involved. Sometimes I wonder if helping was worth it, if Eric's warning wasn't just about Martin, but about the kind of mess you get yourself into when you can't let things go. There are nights when I lie awake, thinking about Granville, about the choices I made, and about the people I left behind. Maybe if I'd just kept my head down, none of this would have happened. But then again, maybe it was only a matter of time before Martin's secrets caught up to all of us. Story 2. In 2021, I moved into a small, aging apartment in Brooklyn, looking for a fresh start after my divorce. The place was nothing special, just a creaky building with thin walls and a few noisy neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And after the emotional roller coaster of the divorce, I needed a place where I could put the pieces of my life back together. My next-door neighbor, Claire, was a quiet woman in her early 30s. She was always polite, but distant, the kind of person you'd nod to in the hallway without ever really knowing. I didn't think much of her until I started hearing muffled voices through the walls late at night. Conversations that didn't sound like normal arguments. There was something off, something almost frantic about them. One evening, Claire knocked on my door. She looked nervous, her eyes darting down the hallway as if she was expecting someone to jump out at her. She asked if I'd seen anyone hanging around her apartment recently. She said it casually, but her voice wavered and her hands were shaking. I told her no, and she nodded, thanking me before quickly disappearing back into her apartment. I chalked it up to city paranoia. Brooklyn could be rough, and everyone had their moments of unease. But there was something about her eyes, wide, scared, that stayed with me. A few days later, a package meant for Claire was mistakenly delivered to me. It was heavy, wrapped in thick brown paper, and it smelled faintly metallic, like rust. I knocked on her door to return it, but she wouldn't even open the door fully. She peeked out, saw the package, and shook her head. "It's not mine," she said, her voice tight. She practically begged me to throw it away. I tried to argue, to tell her that it had her name on it, but she just shook her head harder, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, "just get rid of it." I ended up tossing it in the dumpster out back, but the whole exchange left me uneasy. What was she so afraid of? Then came the night of the screams. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed when I heard a loud thud from Claire's apartment, followed by muffled screams. My heart jumped into my throat. I got up, pressing my ear to the wall, and called out, "Claire, are you okay?" There was a long pause before she answered, her voice trembling. "I'm fine. Everything's fine." But it didn't sound fine. It sounded like she was barely holding it together. I stood there for a while, listening, but everything went quiet after that. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she'd asked me to leave it alone, but the sound of those screams kept echoing in my mind. A week later, I came home to find my apartment ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, papers were scattered, but nothing was missing. I called the landlord, furious, and he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said Claire had come to him earlier that day, saying I was out of town and that she needed to get into my apartment to grab something for me. She'd used my spare key. I confronted her that evening, banging on her door until she opened it. She looked exhausted, her eyes sunken, and she didn't deny it. Instead, she just said, "I'm sorry. I had no choice." She wouldn't explain further, and I was too angry and too confused to press her. I just wanted to be done with whatever was going on. The last night I saw Claire, I was trapped in my apartment. It was late, and I heard her banging on the wall between our units, shouting, "They're coming! They're coming for both of us!" Her voice was raw with panic. I ran to my door, but when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. It was like someone had jammed it from the outside. My heart pounded as I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate. I could hear Claire still shouting, her voice getting more and more desperate. I ran to the window, fumbling with the latch, and managed to push it open just as I heard my front door being forced. I didn't think. I just climbed out, scrambling down the fire escape as fast as I could. The next morning, the police were everywhere. Claire was gone, and they found blood in her apartment, a lot of it. One of the officers told me they'd been looking for her for weeks. She'd been involved with some kind of smuggling ring, using her apartment to hide stolen goods. She'd been trying to get out, to disappear, and she'd used me as an alibi, as a shield. But when they caught up to her, I was nearly collateral damage. I packed up and moved out the next week. I didn't want to know anymore. I didn't want to be involved. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice in my head, shouting that they were coming, and I wonder if she ever really got away, or if she was just another ghost left behind in Brooklyn. Story 3. In August 2015, I was 22, driving cross-country from Phoenix to Denver with my best friend Jake. We had both just graduated from community college and decided to take the trip before getting caught up in jobs and responsibilities. We were on a budget, and the scenic back road through the desert seemed like a perfect way to save some money and see more of the country. The first few hours were beautiful, stretches of red rock, endless sky, and not another car in sight. But by sunset, we realized we hadn't seen a soul in hours. The road was empty, and the fading light made the desert feel vast and isolating. It was just after the sun dipped below the horizon that we spotted it. A rusted sedan on the side of the road, its windows shattered and the hood popped open. Jake slowed down, craning his neck to get a better look. "Should we stop?" I asked, though I already knew what he'd say. He shook his head. "Nah, let's keep going. Whoever it was is long gone." There was something eerie about the car, though. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time, but there were fresh tire tracks leading away from it. I didn't mention that to Jake. We just kept driving, the atmosphere in the car growing tenser by the minute. About 10 miles later, we saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road waving us down. She looked frantic, her hair a mess, her clothes dirty. I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. "Don't stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Jake was already pulling over, his eyes full of concern. "We can't just leave her out here," he said, opening his window. The woman ran up to the car, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Please," she begged. "My car broke down. I just need a ride to the nearest town." There was something about her that made my skin crawl, but Jake was already unlocking the back door. She said her name was Emily. As we drove, she kept glancing back down the road, like she was expecting someone to follow. She asked us where we were headed, and when Jake told her Denver, she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice urgent. "You should take the next left. It's a shortcut." I frowned, looking at the GPS. There was no left turn coming up, no shortcut. I nudged Jake, trying to signal that something was off, but he just shrugged, trusting Emily's directions over the GPS. We took the turn, and that's when the GPS lost signal. The road was narrow, barely more than a dirt path, and the further we went, the more I felt like we were heading into trouble. After about half an hour, Emily directed us to a gas station, if you could even call it that. It was more of a shack with a couple of rusted pumps out front. The place was desolate, the kind of spot that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. Two men were standing by the pumps, watching us as we pulled in. Emily leaned forward, her voice low. "Just let me out here," she said. "I need to talk to them." Jake nodded, putting the car in park. "Wait here," he told me as he got out, following Emily toward the men. I stayed in the car, my heart pounding as I watched them talk. The men were tall, rough-looking, and the way they spoke to Jake made my stomach twist in knots. One of them gestured toward the car, and I saw Jake shake his head, his face pale. When Jake got back in the car, he was shaking. "We need to leave, now," he said, his voice tight. I didn't ask questions. I just started the car and hit the gas. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the two men get into an old truck, their headlights flicking on as they started to follow us. "What did they say?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake just shook his head. "They had a gun," he said. "Emily was trying to negotiate something about us. I think they were planning to rob us, or worse." The truck sped up, closing the distance between us. They were trying to run us off the road, their front bumper nudging the back of our car. I could hear Jake breathing heavily beside me, his eyes wide with fear. The road was narrow, winding, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead in the darkness. I swerved, trying to keep control as the truck rammed into us again. "Just keep going," Jake shouted, his voice cracking. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The truck was relentless, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Then, out of nowhere, the road split. I took the turn without thinking, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. The truck tried to follow but overshot, skidding off the road and into the ditch. I didn't wait to see if they'd recover. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. We didn't stop until we reached a small town, hours later. We pulled into a motel parking lot, and I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Jake looked at me, his face pale, his eyes haunted. "We almost didn't make it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We never spoke about it again after that night. We finished the trip in silence. The radio turned low, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I never picked up a hitchhiker again. To this day, I can still see Emily's face in my mind, the way she looked at those men, the way she tried to lead us into that trap. I don't know what would have happened if Jake hadn't heard them talking, if we hadn't managed to escape. But I do know one thing. There are some roads you should never take, and some people you should never trust. And sometimes, a shortcut is the quickest way to disaster. Story 4. In 2019, I worked as a handyman for a landlord who owned several properties in Detroit. One of my regular tasks was maintaining an old apartment building on the east side. The place was run down, with peeling paint, flickering lights, and a basement that always seemed to have a chill, no matter the season. The tenants mostly kept to themselves, but one guy, Tony from 3B, was different. Tony was the kind of guy who always had something to say, and most of the time, it was a complaint. Lately, his complaints had taken a strange turn. He kept talking about weird noises coming from the basement, scratching, shuffling, sometimes even whispering late at night. I figured it was just the old pipes or rats, but Tony seemed genuinely scared. One afternoon, after Tony had cornered me in the hallway for the third time that week, I decided to check it out. The basement was dimly lit, the single bulb swinging slightly as I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs. The air smelled damp, like mold and dust, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. I walked past the rows of storage units, most of them filled with forgotten junk. Old furniture, cardboard boxes, broken appliances. It was when I reached the far corner that I noticed something odd. One of the storage units had a broken lock, the metal twisted and cut cleanly. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, expecting to find the usual clutter. Instead, I found piles of random junk, but the locks themselves, there were several of them, all broken, tossed in a pile like someone had been collecting them. My gut told me something wasn't right. A few days later, Tony caught me as I was leaving the building. He looked more on edge than usual, his eyes darting around as if he was expecting someone to jump out at him. "The noises," he said, his voice low. "They're worse on weekends. and I swear, someone's been sneaking into the building at night." I tried to reassure him, told him it was probably just teenagers messing around, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "No, man, it's not just that. I've seen someone. A shadow moving around down there." I could see the fear in his eyes, and it made me uneasy. I promised him I'd take another look, though part of me just wanted to ignore it and move on. One night, I was down in the basement, working on the boiler. It was late, past midnight, and the building was quiet. Too quiet. I was tightening a valve when I heard it, a soft shuffle like someone moving in the dark. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The lights flickered, and for just a second I saw it, a figure darting between the storage units. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the rows of dusty storage units and the echo of my own breathing. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day I decided to take a closer look. There was something about the basement that didn't sit right with me, and I was tired of Tony's constant fear rubbing off on me. I started moving some old shelves that had been pushed against the back wall, and that's when I found it. A door. It was hidden behind the shelves, almost like someone didn't want it to be found. The door was old, the paint chipped, and the handle rusted. I hesitated for a moment before turning the knob. It opened with a groan, revealing a small, makeshift living space. There was a cot pushed against the wall, a few blankets, and scattered papers covering the floor. A knife lay on the ground, the blade glinting in the dim light. My stomach turned as I realized someone had been living down here, hiding right under our noses. I told Tony about what I found, and he insisted we confront whoever it was. He was tired of being scared, and to be honest, so was I. We decided to stake out the basement that night, waiting to see if the person would return. We sat in the dark, the only light coming from the small flashlight Tony had brought. Hours passed, and just when I was starting to think we were wasting our time, we heard it. The creak of the basement door opening, followed by footsteps. My heart pounded as I saw a shadow moving toward the hidden door. Tony and I stood up, the flashlight beam catching the figure in its glow. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was holding a knife, her hands trembling. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't call the cops. I'm not here to hurt anyone." Tony and I exchanged a look, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. She looked desperate, cornered. We tried to talk to her, to get her to put the knife down, but she backed away, her eyes darting between us and the stairs. "You don't understand," she said. "He's looking for me. I have nowhere else to go." Before we could say anything else, she turned and ran, disappearing up the stairs and out into the night. The next morning, the landlord called me. He was furious. Someone had reported seeing a strange woman running from the building, and he wanted to know what the hell was going on. I didn't have the heart to tell him the whole story. Later, Tony and I found out from one of the other tenants that the woman had been a former resident, hiding from an abusive ex who had been stalking her. She'd been living in fear, using the basement as a refuge. By confronting her, we'd forced her to flee, and now she was out there, alone, with nowhere to hide. Tony and I were left shaken, wondering if we'd made things worse by getting involved. The basement felt different after that, darker, emptier, and every time I went down there I couldn't help but think about the woman and whether she'd found a place where she could finally feel safe.